Welcome everybody to this inaugural session of the Standing Group on Public Policies online seminar series. My name is Johanna Künzler and I am part of the steering committee of the new Standing Group on Public Policy at the European Consortium for Political Research. And I'm in the committee together with Karin Ingold, with Johanna Hornung and with Willem Nowotny, who are also present in this session. We are very happy to have you all here. So as we are a newly formed standing group, I just wanted to quickly say we are excited about a host of new activities that we will do in the next weeks and months. And if you want to keep updated to our activities, you should go to the ECPR website and absolutely become a member of our standing group, because that's how you will receive our emails and also see, for example, when we do the next online seminar. So this platform here specifically will serve to discuss cutting-edge research in public policy with different speakers. And today we are very happy to have as our first speaker of this online seminar series, Professor Claudio Radaelli. And I'm very happy to introduce him briefly to you. So Claudio Radaelli is a professor of public policy at the University College of London. He's currently on leave there and working at the University of Florence in the European University Institute at the School of Transnational Governance. And he's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. He is renowned for his many publications in the field. He works on the policy process of the European Union, specifically on effects of EU policy on the member states. He's also interested in the roles and usage of expertise, of narratives and ideas in public policy and administration. And he is the editor-in-chief of the International Review of Public Policy, journal that is open access, and you might have heard of it already. He received 2 advanced ERC grants, and one of these will be today's topic of his presentation. And I will give you the floor, Claudio Radaelli, to present. We have about, I think, an hour in total, so just take as much time as you need.
Okay, thank you very much, Johanna, and the organizers, as well as the steering committee of the new standing group. I remember we were together in Poland, I think, discussing the possible creation of the standing group. So it's great to see this coming together, and I hope there will be a stream of seminars, initiatives, research groups. So long live the standing group. What I present today is essentially a book that has been written but is still being adjusted and revised so that the publisher is entirely happy. I will use slides. I presented something like that the International Public Policy Association in summer, so some slides will be repeated. Apologies. So this is work that I've been doing in the Protego ERC project with Gaia Tofone, who kindly is with us tonight, Claire Dallop, Jonathan Kankaji. The book as an additional author that was not in the original team of the ERC project, Claudio Wagemann. Claudius was supposed to be our advisor, but since he's so good, he jumped from advisor to co-author, and I'm really glad he got passionate about this project. So I already said that. Let's see what the paper is about and try to minimize something. Okay, so it is a paper on regulation, but especially on the design of regulatory policy instruments, and there is a lot of literature on how and if regulation matters for business, for corruption. The causality is not really clear whether it's the quality of regulation that matter, whether what matters is the quantity of rules. That's the argument about red tape. But just to say, there is a literature out there that is pushing us towards the effects of regulation. So we are thinking about regulation as the cause of an effect, but what are these effects is not clear. There is a more political conversation on these regulatory tools at the level of the World Bank, OECD, and the European Union that goes under the name of the Better Regulation Agenda. There is also a vast literature on regulation being important, and not so much for the outcomes on, let's say, number of foreign direct investment decisions, but for accountability. So more of a governance literature that looks at the benefits for governance of some regulatory regimes and regulatory policy tools. But also, as that's what the paper says, is a bit of a story where the pieces of the puzzle do not fit into place, meaning that when we look at the diffusion of regulatory instruments, and we are looking at that in the context of the EU 27 plus the UK, so 28 cases over a number of years, we would expect our theories to tell us something about how the countries get to cluster, and in terms of whether it's Europeanization, varieties of capitalism, legal origin, for example. But as we shall see, these theories do not seem to work in our empirical case, and then we can discuss why is that we cannot just use one of these beautiful theories that exist out there and have proved powerful until now. Go back to the screen. Okay, so research questions about, okay. We are looking at design. There is a lot of work on design mattering per se, for example, by Saba Siddiqui. So the question here is, what is the effect of designing instruments of regulatory policy in terms of the quality of the business environment, perception of corruption, environmental performance? No one has tried to make the claim that regulation is good for all these three outcomes, or bad for, but there is something in the literature on business decisions, on corruption, a little bit also on obviously environmental regulation, getting the so-called double dividend, regulates and therefore protects standards of environmental quality, but at the same time double dividend because environmental regulation is supposed to push companies beyond the possibility frontier. So we are pushing innovation through environmental regulation. And the question we ask about, the metaphor of the puzzle and the 500 pieces of the puzzle is about what are the combinations of these design variables of regulation that are sufficient for a country to fall into the basket of quality of the business environment, perception of corruption, and high environmental performance. Knowing that there can be equifinality, so there could be one or more than one way to achieve that outcome. And also, as we shall see later, multifinality. So there are some cases where one type of design achieves two of these outcomes. So you can have a low corruption and a good business environment, so to speak. Obviously, no one is making the argument about regulation being a panacea for every single outcome. But we have some very specific cases of multi-finality. Why did we do this research on regulation? Because, well, we know for sure that the quality of the business environment, corruption, specifically corruption, are not determined mostly by regulation. There is social capital, culture, legacy, varieties of capitalism that probably matter more, but most of these variables are very slow to change. You cannot change social capital in a country. There is also there are even arguments about religion and the efficiency of the business environment. But then we cannot just selectively import some believers from one religion into a country to increase on the quality scores. Whereas, by contrast, regulatory instruments can be changed by every government. So it's the malleability of these instruments that interest us. And if we find something that can be done by designing instruments one way or the other, we reasoned at the beginning of the project, we are providing findings that point to some policy recommendations. Okay, so before I put the cart before the proverbial horse, what are we talking about here? We're not just talking about individual rules, but rather about procedure, what a lawyer would call administrative procedure. And specifically in this paper, at least we have other data, but in this paper, consultation on the formulation of regulation, impact assessment on new legislative proposals, freedom of information, all these three operate when a rule is being made, and the Ombudsman can intervene when in a procedure there is some feeling of maladministration, vexatious practices, etc. So if individual rules can be good or bad, these four administrative procedures should be such that they, on average, at least provide the riverbanks for the administration and for the preparation and formulation of rules. I said delivery, and that's wrong, because one thing we do not look at is inspection and inspectors' modes, behavior, inspection regimes. That is more on delivery that one may rightly reason could have been in this project, but every project has its own limitations. So those are, if you wish, our kind of independent variables. And when you look at the EU plus the UK, that was, as we know, in the EU for a good number of years, it's not difficult to formulate expectations. So how are the cluster going to look like when we look at the effect of rules? Well, one could say we're going to find some clustered effects for Europeanization. That's what Tanya Berzel said. Or maybe we're going to find a difference between newcomers and the original 6 or 12 members of 15 of the EU, and then we have Eastern Europe, etc. Varieties of capitalism will tell us that we're going to find some differences between coordinated economies, liberal market economies, and then the so-called dependent market economies. So here, Eastern Europe, and according to recent papers, Greece should be in a cluster. Legal origin provides different expectations depending, and it is very powerful predictor in general, especially on regulation, as shown by Andrei Schleifer, of Germanic, Scandinavian, English, French. Then we also consider the public management literature that has the classic Rechtsstaat versus countries like the Netherlands and the UK, Ireland, that are more managerial. So we should find a core around Germany, and then the Nordic model somewhere, and the managerial countries being clustered around the UK experience. So just to say that we can compose ex ante our expectations in terms of clusters with these literatures that are very powerful, but also very macro. Plus each specialized literature on corruption and regulation, for example, has its own expectations. And I don't go into that, but we do it in the individual chapters dedicated to the empirical analysis. We have three of these chapters. Anyway, so expectations, easy to formulate, but then what happens when we go to measurement? Okay. What we did is to look at our 4 instrumentations, consultation, impact assessment, ombudsman, and access to regulation as what Ostrom would call action situations. So each design of stakeholder engagement, of impact assessment, etc., in our theory of measurement is constituted by Elinor Ostrom's rules. So that's the institutional grammar tool. These rules provide a theory-driven approach. So instead of opening a consultation procedure and describing it, we abstract and say, what are the 7 rules that define this action situation? And then we look for the same 7 rules in the other 3 procedures. Therefore, with a more theory-based yardstick that is not sensitive to the idiosyncratic characteristics of each instrument. So that was the idea that then one could say each action situation, consultation, ombudsman, fits into a broader situation that we call rulemaking. For those who have not seen the 7 rules, they're very simple. Here it's from Carter and others. So imagine getting into impact assessment or freedom of information and saying, okay, what are the positions? Who does what? With what boundaries, prerequisites? So for example, you can get access to information, but not in the Ministry of Defense. That's a boundary. Choice, what can be done? Aggregation, decision-making, majority, qualified majority, review, scrutiny. Information that goes into the system. Payoff rules are incentives or sanctions, rewards or sanctions. And finally, the scope rules are about the aims of what is identified, desired, or even, apologies for the chair, prohibited outcomes. So you see, with these 7 rules, what we did is to do data collection aided by a team that was hired for a short period of time, between 3 and 5 months, of 40 lawyers. They were trained, supervised, and we asked them, we are interested in the positions in the Freedom of Information Act. Where does the Act identify these positions? And the position may be identified by a sentence like any citizen, or any citizen with an interest in this specific act, or any citizens of the EU, or any persons, any adults. All these, we took the exact wording of the law, and then we validated on the basis of our knowledge of the procedure. There was a bit of a back and forth with the lawyers. In the end, as it is often the case with political scientists, everything ends in a spreadsheet, in an Excel, in outputting zeros, ones, a number of rules, etc. On causality, so we have now the measurement of the design of the independent variable, so to speak. Because on causality, we thought, obviously, there's going to be a limited average effect of these procedures on corruption. For example, corruption is certainly better explained by social capital, by culture, by family ties, by traditions. But what is what is it that can be an effect of design? Could perception of corruption be an effect of this cause that we call design of regulation? And that's that, even if the effect is econometrically speaking limited, and we don't know with only 28 cases, it's still interesting as a question to see whether, as the World Bank says, you want to diminish corruption, you have to get your regulation in place and cut red tape. But is it true? That's what we are saying. And that's what leads us to a choice for set theory, qualitative comparative analysis. And now that can be very simple or very esoteric, depending on the audience we have here tonight. So we take for all the variables that we compute it in terms of position rules, boundary rules, payoff rules, choice rules, information rules, scope rules, aggregation rules, are almost 300. We reduce complexity by using principal component analysis, and those principal components became the conditions, or if you think econometrically, the cause or independent variables of our design. And then for the outcome measure, we looked at existing data. Doing business, we know about the scandal, but it didn't involve the European countries. In any case, doing business correlates with many other indicators that say more or less the same. And then for corruption, we look at the WGI indicators and not Transparency International. I mean, again, we looked at the correlation that for European countries with transparency is practically 90%. So the outcome measure may not be good, but all these measures correlate highly. And then we have an indicator of environmental performance produced by Bertelsmann Foundation. So what comes out once we do the analysis? We have no necessary condition, but go back to the question I asked. Is the design of these instruments a sufficient condition for some countries to have ease of business? Well, the answer, as I said, is equifinality. We have different group of countries that have different solutions. So some features, remember when you see cons, is not consultation, yes, no, but it's a principal component that groups a number of variables, obviously calibrated to become a condition. So consultation, impact assessment, freedom of information for these countries. But you see that, for example, in other countries, the absence of design features in consultation and the absence of highly proceduralized freedom of information, together with highly proceduralized impact assessment, that matters. And then we have, Denmark explained twice here in this case, also with the presence of the Ombudsman. First glance, this doesn't look like a variety of capitalism, although one could say UK, Ireland, Estonia, to some extent, much less Latvia and Slovenia, resemble a little bit liberal market economies. When we look at low corruption, the solutions point to the presence of impact assessment, that in 2 cases out of 3 is somewhat central, but again, for several countries in our solutions, the countries of solution 1, is the absence of highly, so absence of consultation means there is consultation, but the number of rules is not very high. The number of procedures, of steps is not high, and it goes well with low formalization across the board in solution 1. Now, just to say that when you plot this, except from Malta, which is there unexplained, that's a decent explanation of our solutions. I move quickly just to show how these things look at the environmental performance, where you have the kind of a procedure matters solution for Estonia, Ireland, Latvia, Poland, Slovenia, UK, but also the other solutions with, again, lack of proceduralization. I say this because in Denmark there is consultation, obviously, is not highly formalized. So Denmark is not rich in terms of rules on how consultation should be made. And indeed, everyone knows is done. Consultation is done through the system of hearings in terms of a tradition of consultation. So what is the story here, apart from the many solutions? we do not confirm expectations from macro theories, except a little bit for varieties of capitalism that seems to go well in some ways for the outcome ease of business. This could be because these theories are macro, whereas our data are very much at the policy level, at the level of administrative procedures. In the book, we also have a lot on the qualitative part of QCA, and so the type of Administrative Procedure Act, for example, explains a lot of our cases of these strange bedfellows like Denmark, Netherlands, and Portugal. They say, why are they together? The solution or the explanation is generally in the history of administrative law, or in other cases, the presence of advocacy coalitions for environmental impact assessment in some countries. So the qualitative matters a lot in our QCA explanation. Essentially, and I'll finish in a couple of minutes. So we have two types of Europe, essentially. One that goes well with formalization, like the EU, that has 500 pages of better regulation procedures, step 1, step 2, step 25, and a Europe of informality and social norms. Sometimes we just have a story where this procedure probably have a little traction on the ground, so they are not just informal, they are symbolic. The lesson we learned is that we should stop looking at stakeholder engagement or freedom of information and look exactly at what are the micro components of the design of each instrument, because those are the components that make a difference in QCA. Let's see what are the implications. The implication is that contrary to what the OECD says, or the European Commission also does, high proceduralization may not be good for some types of council. Actually, high proceduralization, designing everything ex ante, may create the type of regulatory rigidity that favors corruption. But in some cases, as we've seen, an investment in formal procedures pays off, as we've seen in some of the recipes for corruption and the first two for environmental performance. We also found that impact assessment is like parsley that makes most of the recipe interesting, and is the variable that we find more often than not with a positive sign in most of the solutions. As I said, and I skip on this, we also have cases of multi-finality, in which case with the same design you get two different governance outcomes. Otherwise, something we would say to the policymakers, in general, you cannot reach all the outcomes or even two with the same design of administrative procedures. Something that is good for corruption may not be good for quality of the business environment. So the insistence of some of the international organizations on these procedures as they are good governance without qualifications is a bit exaggerated. I hope that presenting a very big book in 20 minutes was not too much. I took my risks, I know, and apologies to I see Giuseppe and others who have been already listening to some of these at the IPA conference in Toronto. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I will applaud live to put some audio to the visual clapping that I see on the screen. Yes, thanks a lot for this very, very interesting presentation. I already see a first hand that has gone up. I suggest that we open the round now for questions. And as Aima has done already, if you could use the raise your hand feature if you want to speak, that would be great. You can use your hand feature on the bottom of your screen. If you click on reactions, then you can raise your hand. And maybe we take 2 or 3 questions and comments before Claudio gets the first opportunity to respond. So Aima, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. My question for Claudio is how this phenomena fits into the marketplace and the regulation of businesses when we specifically design governance, keeping intact the social structure, because sometimes we always encounter some sort of, different circumstances where the social capital does not allow much space for businesses to really function. So that's my question.
Thank you. Niels Bandelo can go next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudio. And of course, great presentation. I'm very happy that I now know everything about this famous project. I've got actually one question regarding the dependent variable and one question regarding the explanatory part of the equation that you've just presented. Regarding the dependent variable or the outcome, if you use the QCA speech, am I right that you're looking for one point in time for the results in corruption and environment policies and all the other things? Wouldn't it be interesting to see the development of these outcome variables as if you look for political effects? And probably related to that, as I'm involved in the SGI project, have you somehow controlled for measurement mistakes as well? At least one of the data points has been produced by people like myself, and I know that these people make a lot of mistakes. Well, okay, that's the dependent variable, but regarding the independent thing, as a political scientist, I've asked myself if you have included political variables like party politics and the power of organized interests, which are classical things to probably be important for us. Thank you very much.
I think that's already a great host of questions. Thank you very much. Maybe Claudio, you want to do a first answer?
Yes, at any point in time, I see Gaia is also in the meeting. Maybe others, if they want to take the difficult questions, I don't mind. Let's see. Well, essentially, regarding the marketplace and the role of social capital, if I understood the question correctly, the answer would be that certainly the marketplace, or for that matter, the quality of social relations, whether they are corrupt or not, is dependent on a number of variables that have been studied by the literature in the field. And these variables, as you said correctly, do not leave much space to policy design. So yeah, if you have a 70%, let's say, of something shaped by informality, social capital, tradition, you cannot easily touch the 70%. But here is the thing. We said, well, what about the 25% where policymakers can change design? Obviously, it's not so difficult to change a guidance or a design of procedures to create a new regulation. That's much less difficult than trying to affect directly social capital. So although we know that we are talking, in some cases, not necessarily, however, for the quality of the business environment with regulation, and regulation is not the major, probably the major force, we are still looking at variables that can be manipulated with some ease by policymakers, and also without too much fuss or too much confrontation. It's not like changing the constitution of a country from parliamentary to presidential. So that was I guess a true econometrician would say, well, but the effect of these changes is going to be much more limited than if only we had a different level of social capital. And that's obviously an objection that can be taken. However, we were thinking about instruments that can be manipulated and malleable, that can be changed by policymakers. But I got your point. So our findings come with the caveat that you described. And this is right on all accounts. See, I raised my hands. Now, we took some years, or the weighted average of the last 3 years, or talking about the dependent variable, or thinking that, okay, we had almost 20 years of better regulation, Freedom of Information Acts, consultation. Before 2000, there was not much left. And we thought, let's see if there is an effect of these instruments, not after 1 year, but after a number of years. In the qualitative part, however, we control for the changes. So if a country changed the procedure 2 times, 3 times, what we don't do is kind of event history analysis that can always be done. And I'll be glad to meet with you and discuss the data, whether that can be done. Obviously, you would not expect a procedure to be introduced, let's say, on impact assessment in the year 2001 and have an effect on perception of corruption in 2002. The idea is that after 10, 20 years of transparency in the formulation of regulation, the people start thinking that perhaps the government is transparent overall. But a very good point. And we always thought we would do this kind of analysis. So you will receive an email asking for a meeting, Niels. On the independent variable, we talked about organized groups in the chapter on the environment, where we talk about advocacy, green advocacy coalitions in the different countries, and how they influence a little bit our position of countries. That, however, and you're right, is not codified in a variable. There was a moment in the project where we thought we would use the strength of pressure groups as a classic indicator to put as a moderating variable, so that they should moderate the effects of what we say, because then you immediately have the corporatist countries as opposed to the pluralist countries. So you can imagine the effect of regulatory procedure going into direction depending on the strength of pressure groups. So I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying we have not done it, and there is room for digging in the data in that direction. And on political parties, this is my bias. I'm not a strong believer that this regulatory design is a matter sensitive to party politics, although it's true the right-wing parties are keen on wars on red tape in general more than left-wing parties in general, with some exceptions, like the UK Labour was very much for reducing red tape, and therefore was not distinguishable from the UK Conservatives. But yeah, that's probably a bias, and not looking at the governments and the color of governments during these 20 years.
Thank you very much. So we have room for further questions. Maybe I can go first to give other people some more time to think. So I have a more general question concerning your project, basically from narrative scholar to narrative scholar, because you are also very interested in narratives. And I noticed, of course, that you also framed your presentation in the terms of what's the story behind our results. So your affinity to narratives is very obvious. As I understood it, narratives were not part of your QCA, right? But I was wondering whether you still have some interesting insights on how narratives come into play in the questions that you analyzed.
Yes, a lot. I think that there has been exactly a narratives of regulatory reform as good for the control of corruption, good for the quality of the business environment. In this case, not just a narrative, but also a number of economic papers. And actually, there is not much empirical support for, I'm not saying they are wrong, but there is not enough literature supporting this notion. And when Bob Hahn, for example, looked at the US, and he's a hardcore economist, he concluded that these regulatory reforms, they are good for governance. They add transparency, accountability, and maybe the economy is another story, he was saying. No? Yeah, okay, well, just one case of the US. So I think the narrative has been very much on deregulation, cutting red tape, so that, there is a paper by Cari Coglianesi, the regulations are a bit like the migrants in right-wing narratives. They come from outside, no one wants them, they destroy jobs, they do bad things. The international organizations have been more in a neutral area, talking about regulatory quality. So the big ambiguity of the narrative of regulatory reform is between those who push for, in the end, regulatory quantity, so they want less regulation, and those who have a more sophisticated understanding of regulatory quality and understanding that actually, as I was saying, good regulations are good, not just for the outcomes like saving lives, which is particularly important, but also for accountability. And there has been a kind of semantic ambiguity in what we mean by good regulation. Even in our project, the narrative is that good regulation can be high formality or high informality. So one thing and the other, which is classic of equifinality, but then the international organizations typically speak with one narrative. They are not educated into equifinality, and they have to provide advice in the, I don't know if you've seen, but there are the 2012 principles of good regulation of the OECD are supposed to be good for 38 countries. So another message in terms of narrative is, let's try talking about equifinality. That may be too much procedure, too much administrative law, may kill the breathing space the countries like Denmark or Sweden have, and every historian of administrative procedure would know that, but perhaps it's not reflected in the narrative of international organizations.
Thank you very much. Johanna Hornung has a question.
Yes, thanks a lot for the talk. Since the question of regulation is also frequently discussed when it comes to crisis and disruptors in the policy process, I was wondering whether you noticed any influence of such crisis or events in these settings. And then also when it comes to the robustness or resilience of systems and instruments, whether there's something interesting you've discovered in these different groups of nations, maybe also.
Yes, I answer, Johanna. I answer to Johannes. So okay, okay. The crisis is really a bad beast for these procedures, because all they do is to slow down the process so that we can think with more evidence about the problems at hand, so that we can formulate legislation with more information. And the presence of an acute crisis like COVID derails some of these instruments. So you can only use them in a post-decisional mode to control for what you have done. So you probe and then you control. or you can use some principles like risk analysis, but certainly under emergency, it's impossible to go for example, the Commission says we should use always 12 weeks of consultation. That would have destroyed any policy planning during a crisis. Resiliency, I don't know, Jan, if you want to look at the data with us, certainly we see countries that stick to a procedural instrument and they don't change it much because we look back at 2019, let's say, and countries that have changed more than once, probably to be more in compliance with the OECD or European Commission templates. And obviously this disrupts predictability, although in some cases you start with a thin, like Germany, a thin procedure, the Blau checklist even of the 90s, and then you create more resilience by adding bodies to the procedures, like the Normen Kontrollrat that didn't exist in the past, and is there to be the custodian of the procedure. So this element of institutional oversight adds resiliency to the procedures, because you have an inbuilt custodian of the procedure.
Aima has I don't know whether it's a follow-up question to her first question or a new topic. Please go ahead.
Yes, that's my second question from Claudio. You mentioned that it took 20 or 10 years to really see the results of such design and all. My question is, how, like, if people are so desperate to see immediate results, what we're going to do? Because as a policymaker, when we experience such things, people need like the results overnight. They need quick answers. They don't have that patience, to wait for 10 or 20 years. So what would you suggest, like how we gonna make up for that?
Aima, that's spot on. And that explains the low political attractiveness of these reforms. Not just us, but everyone who studied this stuff shows that there's a kind of learning process. You introduce them, you make mistakes. You also educate the bureaucrats to handle them. You have to create a capacity. Imagine, Freedom of Information Act initially, it was an irritation in Britain. Even for some politicians, even now it's an irritation in Britain. But then you educate, say, okay, this works, there is procedure, there's investment, we do training, so there is capacity building. And politicians say, we just want to get something that the constituencies out there understand, or the business community understands. And that explains why stripped down versions of these instruments, like targets on administrative burdens, regulatory budgets, limits to the number of regulations, examples for 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out. They've been very popular with Trump, with the UK Conservatives, in Germany, in the Netherlands in 2004, 2010. So they are not the best, these targets on regulation, these caps on rules, because they don't examine the quality, the benefit cost ratio of individual rules. They just look at gross numbers. I don't know what to say. If not, that probably is good if politicians are not too interested in these reforms and they come more from the bureaucracy, from advocacy groups, from the international organizations. I never seen a top politician really excited by stakeholders engagement, or I've seen many irritated by freedom of information. So probably, something like the Ombudsman, when these things work, they should be assets of civil society. But I don't have it's like selling something that slow to politicians with a 4-year horizon is impossible, I think. And many of these reforms were under pressure from the OECD, from the Commission, imitation, working groups of bureaucrats at the OECD, some policy networks that felt there was the need for more streamlined consultation, but not because of enlightened politicians in general.
So that's like, that's give me another point. What, in your opinion, is enlightened politician? Can you give me an example of enlightened politician? Can you name anyone?
Yeah. But I'm not trustworthy on this. You know, I'm not an expert on politicians. So what I say, I've seen some ministers that over the years have taken some interest in this policy, and Lord Mandelson in some stages of the UK reform, like 2009, 2008, the early Tony Blair had an interest. Then David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, was very interested in the bad things like cutting red tape, but at least he put up a website asking citizens to name and shame bad regulations. And then he said, if in 3 months the department does not defend robustly the regulation, I will cut this rule. In the Netherlands, we have seen some ministers like Gary Zalm was very interested. In Italy, Franco Bassanini in the late 1990s, he single-handedly wrote the new procedure for consultation and impact assessment in 1999. In the Commission, I know it doesn't get good press at the moment, but Franz Timmermans was somewhat, and then you know what, I would look then at some MEPs over the years. In the past, they were all conservatives, and now we find some green parties that have some interest in environmental assessment, gender impact assessment. So the Parliament, the European one, has produced some green politicians that are critical of the status quo and make proposals for pushing more on gender impact assessment and environmental assessment of new regulations of the Commission. Don't quote on me on this list because I'm not an expert on individual politicians.
Ilana Schröder has also raised her hand.
Yes, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I cannot turn on my video because my Wi-Fi does not allow me to do so. I wanted to ask if there's any chance, once we will maybe get the slides later on, I don't know, to get a full list of the conditions you controlled for, because I would be very interested in seeing what your whole truth table was, more or less, not the whole coding process, but just at least to see what conditions you checked and how these results came. That would be amazing. And the question that kind of arrived from a discussion I had with Niels, did policy transfer or policy benchmarking play any role? Was it one of the conditions? Can you say something about that, please?
No, Ilana, one should be more analytical on transfer, diffusion, imitating, emulating from other countries. Once I was in a meeting with Philip Genschel, and he told me, well, this data proved that there has not been policy diffusion or isomorphism. Otherwise, everyone would have copied everyone else. Imagine, the pure imitation from the OECD. The OECD has the template, so you can copy, but then you have a Hungary that does one thing, Poland another, Italy yet another one. You have our recipes, there are always 2 or 3, it's never one. And the countries that not imitate, like you don't have, Scandinavian countries, but maybe Finland is absent. So there is no, intuitively, the data do not seem to suggest that. Analytically is a different story. So one should study exactly, since we have the years of the reforms, for example, seeing whether there is a clustered wave of Eastern European countries after 2005, for example, what happens to Bulgaria, Romania in particular. Is also a story ours where we should look more at the negative solutions, because I talked about, low corruption, but what about high corruption in other countries? So the data exists, and I don't think policy diffusion would produce great results, but those are just intuitions supported by the data we have. There is much more research that can be done specifically on this by looking at the raw data and doing a proper test. So glad to talk to you about that.
Perfect, thank you.
So we have room for one last question, maybe. In case nobody has one, I just have one which I'm very curious about, which is really about your process, because you said you hired 40 lawyers to help you in this project. And I've been working in interdisciplinary institutes a lot with lawyers. Well, let's say alongside lawyers mostly. And we had lunch discussions where I learned that they are very nice people and very interesting, but like we didn't have so much to really, we did not have that much common ground, or the understanding was a bit difficult between the two sides. So I was wondering, how did it really go, the collaboration with these lawyers?
Yes, so there was a call for manifestations of interest initially, and then we were below the high thresholds for public procurements, but we had still to demonstrate. But I think you're more interested in the analytical part of that. And the analytical part was that we met for 2 days in London, in a nice place, and we said, this is what we want to know, and I'll send you, Johanna, actually we can publish on the website, this is a protocol of what we are asking you. And there was like 6-7 questions, general, specific to the, say, Freedom of Information Act, and then there was a flow chart. So tell us, can you do in a flow chart the Freedom of Information Act in Spain? Can just to understand whether we were understanding the same thing. And then there were the questions of the 7 rules. They were put in a language that was not Ostromian. So we met with them and said, we come from this tradition, the action situation. For you, the questions would be, who can request access to documents? in the law, how is this who described, in which articles? And the question was that we say, but you say the law, but we have a constitutional law, jurisprudence, guidance, soft law. So what is the legal base? And for example, in the case of Germany, constitutional law has some bearing on who can be consulted, changing to consultation. So you cannot deny that in your analysis. So we said, well, whenever you take us this portion of the law, put alongside the reference where it comes from, constitutional law, primary law, secondary law. And we kind of negotiated with them how far one should be on identifying the legal base. That was really difficult. So then once identified the legal base, they were returning to us the protocols, and then we would ask them questions. We set up also some Google mailing lists so that they could speak to each other, because obviously there is nothing better than an Estonian lawyer explaining to a Spanish lawyer what, whether we're talking about parliamentary consultation or stakeholders consultation, right? So they were sorting their problems internally with that. And then when we came to validation, and Gaia was already part of the project, sometimes we had just to call back and say, we don't understand what you put. And that's a difficulty if your contract is finished, to go back to lawyers. then it's very difficult to ask for additional help. One thing I would suggest if you do a project like this is to embed the network more in your research team. So imagine writing an edited book or just having a conference with all these 40 lawyers, discussing the findings with the political scientists. For us, COVID was a killer because we started really well in London, warm relationships, we understand each other, we're going to do great things. Then COVID hit, so they were sending us the portions of legislation saying nothing else can be done. But one thing where we were slow, also we were not a large team, was to leverage the network and keep it alive, give it a name and bring them to the OECD to discuss something. We missed that bus, and that was not a trivial bus. Don't tell the ERC.
I won't, don't worry.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I'm sure we would have still a lot more to discuss, and I suggest that everybody keeps track of when you publish the book, because I'm sure there will be a lot of interesting additional information in it. And yeah, maybe there will also be some further research published later on. But anyways, thank you very much for being our first speaker, Claudio Radaelli, and also thank you very much to the audience for being here and for engaging in this discussion. I hope we meet again at a next online seminar series event.